Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I think that Matthew, with his story here, is trying to show us the positive good that can come if we overcome the fears. You know, if you look at the Magi, it must have been difficult for them to pick up and follow a star if you go with the story here, and so that you get a certain feel for them as being adventuresome and willing to check things out, or going to Jerusalem and inquiring and so on and following the star again. It's a marvelous statement of an adventuresome spirit.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Eileen O'Brien, the pastoral associate at Corpus Christi University Press. Today, Father Bacik and Ms. O'Brien will be discussing the Magi and overcoming prejudice. Now, here's Father Bacik.
Eileen, let's talk a little bit about the story of the astrologers in the Gospel according to Matthew. It's the thing that we associate with the Feast of the Epiphany, a very important feast in the Christian calendar. In fact, I think you were telling me that in some places it's really outshadows Christmas as an important feast.
I think particularly there's the tradition more of gift-giving that we associate in this country with Christmas is done more traditionally on the Feast of the Three Kings.
And this, of course, takes us back to Matthew's Gospel, and I think there's a whole lot of important things in there, but we might look more carefully at that story to begin with here in chapter 1, verses 1 to 12. Interesting, a whole lot of myths go up around it. We talk about the three kings, where as a matter of fact, it doesn't really say how many there are who came. It says these Magi, or as we commonly translate it these days, astrologers from the East, and we don't know their names, although later tradition has given us those names. I think people know them as Balthazar, Melchior, and Gaspar, the three kings who have come. And so it's interesting the way this story has touched the imagination of people over the years, and people have felt free to add on to it, to interpret it, to use it in various ways. But all part of this general sense of the incarnation, of the infancy accounts, of God becoming man, and the reaction that this had upon the people at the time.
And the sort of response of the strangers, those people who were not a part of the sort of close at hand, but rather that were the strangers from far away. And as you said, all the mythology that has sort of grown up around that particular tradition, just from the short mention that occurs in the Gospel.
And that sort of alerts us perhaps to the possibility of seeing what Matthew himself did as part of legend building. It's hard for some people to understand that, and that the Gospels really are constructed accounts. The Gospels don't claim to be biographies. They're not eyewitness accounts. We're dealing here with marvelous authors in Luke and Matthew who have taken some legendary material and woven it into beautiful stories that have touched us ever since. I think we have to give them the same latitude of myth-building and embellishment that later generations have been part of. So I think that what we see, in other words, what the Scripture scholars tell us today is that these stories are there to teach us important lessons, and maybe we have to cut through to that. But there's a lot of reasons for thinking that we're not dealing with strict history and dealing with this account of the Magi coming from the East. First of all, this phenomenon of the star, while there's been a lot of attempts to explain it as terms of Halley's Comet and a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, and so on, there really isn't a lot of public remembrance of that kind of phenomenal event. You've got other things in the story that really don't make a whole lot of sense. For example, Herod easily calls the scribes and the priests to him, and as we know at that time, they didn't get along at all, and they weren't a cohesive unit at all. He simply couldn't have dealt with them in that way. Then you get the unlikely business of this retinue of three kings going to a particular place, and then which is only 5 miles away from where Herod was in Jerusalem, and then him not being able to find out afterwards from anybody where those three kings went. So you've got all kind of things like this that show us that perhaps we're not dealing with strict history in talking about the three kings, but we are dealing with a marvelous story that teaches us tremendous lessons. And perhaps to do the deconstruction first and to to cut through those kinds of questions and frees us to find the deeper meaning in the story. Do you find that people have a lot of trouble dealing with that kind of deconstruction that I just, demythologizing that I just did there?
Yeah, I find it really kind of a curious thing, I suppose, in some ways. That I guess that some people are disturbed by that. Especially I found it when I was teaching, again, in high school, because younger people, which I thought, I was hearing those kind of deconstruction or demythologizing, some of that kind of thing, when I was in high school, just after the Second Vatican Council, and that was becoming more and more, there were people who were saying that at that point that I was hearing in religious education, and yet I was finding that, students that I taught maybe 5 years ago no one had ever said that to them, and yes, many of them feeling very uncomfortable with that somehow the very root of their faith was being shaken if we tried to say, well, perhaps these were constructed to teach us something.
And yet it does seem that it does release the power of the stories to touch our imaginations and allows us to get at the meaning, which we probably ought to focus on here. I think Matthew's whole business of having Jesus born in Bethlehem is to remind us that he is the son of David, that was the city of David's origins, and the notion was that the Messiah, when he would come, would be a son of David, a descendant, that he would be a great king, even a greater king than David, whom they idolized. And so in Matthew's beautiful story, then Jesus is born in Bethlehem, which qualifies him as a son of David, but at the same time, as we combine the gospel accounts, we see that there's also reason for saying that Jesus is a Nazarene, that he's from Nazareth. So as we get the story in Luke's gospel, they have to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem in order for this birth to take place, and going along with what the census or Caesar Augustus had called for. So Matthew is able to do both things for us. He's able to show that Jesus qualifies as the Messiah because he's born in Bethlehem, but he also a reason for saying that he is the Nazarene, the one from Nazareth, and to locate him there as his hometown.
I think the important thing that in my mind is that we can read the stories as stories and have that kind of value, but then a deeper meaning, as you said before, and to sort of position Jesus in both of those kind of things to see what the importance was of those particular details.
And we also need to think of Matthew's audience. And when he wrote this gospel, we think that he wrote it somewhere in the 80s, commonly dated around 85. Wrote it in a community that it was a mix of Gentile and Jewish converts to Christianity, and a community in which the Gentiles were a growing number and a growing force in that community. So right away what you see here in Matthew's story is the gospel in miniature. In other words, the revelation is given in the person of this small child. The proclamation is given. The word is gotten out. And then you see a twofold reaction. You get Herod and his intimates in Jerusalem, the people who should have known what the scriptures were all about, should have been alert to the coming of the Messiah and ready. They tune it out. They're not ready for it. In fact, they react violently against the Messiah. But on the other hand, who does respond to the message? The group that follows the star, the Magi, these astrologers from the East, foreigners, alien people with no background in the scriptures or anything. They are attentive to nature, God speaking in nature. They follow their conscience, and they come and adore the baby Messiah here, and they're ready to go back and to tell others about this. They're all excited. So what do you think in the year 85, in a community, Matthew's community, he tells them this story? Well, it comes across as a challenge to the Jewish members of the community. They're saying, yes, our brothers and sisters have not accepted the Lord as we would have liked to. And on the other hand, the Gentile members are saying, yay for the Magi. They're us. They're the prototypes of us. That proves that we have got a chance to be in on this whole thing as well.
I think that's the strong sense that the salvation that Jesus represents, and that Jesus, his whole life, is open to all people. It's not, and that sometimes those closest to it, as you said, Herod and the others, who should have been attentive to that and watching, missed the whole point. As sort of reoccurs throughout the scripture, throughout the Gospels, that message seems to come loud and clear. Those who should know the scriptures the best are the ones who somehow don't come to that belief. And yet you have these people who had this strong faith, strong enough to sort of draw them from this distant land, And they come from far away without even seeing, not even having a strong sense. They just know that, and they believe without seeing, and they see later.
You know, when you were saying that, I'm thinking about the contemporary meaning of all of this. The great, if you were to apply it today, it would probably be an indictment of churchgoers, wouldn't it? It would be the people who are in danger of being self-righteous, the churchy people among us. We'd have to look at ourselves and say, are there ways in which we think we have it made because we have the Bible, because we have the guidance of the church, because we go to the Lord's Supper regularly or whatever? That maybe there's a built-in tendency to be self-righteous about this, to think that one, especially in our own Catholic tradition, one of our problems has always been the notion of earning heaven, as though we could pile up enough merits in this way to almost force God to give us this great reward that we call heaven. So we'd have to look to ourselves when we're reading that story, and we read about Herod and the chief priests and so on, not recognizing the Messiah. Are we churchgoers in danger of that same kind of failure to see the coming of the Lord?
It seems to me that one of the things that we have to look at is that our participation in whatever kind of worship, and that should really lead us to be more open to other people and accepting and understanding perhaps that God's love and His salvation, His offer and invitation is there for everyone. And it's not just the property of those people who belong to some sort of organized religion or who read the scriptures regularly. That it's, that invitation is there for everyone. And the challenge is even more for us who in a sense have read that message or heard the message continually to then live it out.
I think of unhappy statistics that come to mind about church-going people. One, Gordon Allport did a classic study of Prejudice many years ago, and what he found out was that the average church-going person tended to be more prejudiced than the average non-church-going person. And that's a horrible indictment in the light of what you were just saying about the way that the gospel ought to open us up and make us more tolerant and so on. And yet it's almost as though the church-going and the big involvement has, at least for some people, functioned exactly the opposite of that. It has made them more intolerant, more self-righteous, more willing to exclude others from God's grace and salvation.
It comes down to something that, for very many reasons, things that I've been reading lately or talking about just seem to keep returning to the same kind of theme in my own mind, that sense of who I am and the constant uncovering deeper of who I am personally can allow me so much more freedom to interact with people who are very different from myself and not be threatened by that. And I think when you speak of prejudice, that's so often what I see, is that sense that I keep people out and I keep them away because I'm afraid that I will think that their way might be the right way and I'm wrong because I don't have enough strength and instead seeing that what I have is good for me, and what they have might be very good for them, and it's not a matter of one is better than the other, but different.
That fear that you're talking about comes to mind, Eileen, when as you're recounting that. I remember watching the series The Long Search, which was a series on world religions, and I was sitting watching the one on Hinduism with a group, and in the group there was a young woman who at one point said to me, well, we should turn this off, or we shouldn't watch this. Aren't you afraid to watch this? And I said, well, what's the problem? Why are you saying that? And she said, well, it's giving such a positive portrayal of it. It looks so good. It could get in your head and, it would take me away from my Christian faith. And I remember telling her, I said, I really don't have that fear. I don't feel as though we need to be afraid of this positive portrayal of Hinduism at all. But I think she represented the kind of problem that you're talking about. Maybe she wasn't feeling secure in her own faith, or she had doubts and questions and so on. When she's looking at this positive picture of Hinduism, it's looking attractive to her, and she begins to be afraid that somehow maybe she doesn't really have the truth, or really doesn't have God's final message or something, and that causes great consternation. So maybe you are right in saying that part of that problem is the fear and the lack of confidence in one's own tradition.
I think that the other thing that you just said really hits on one of the problems that I see, is that somehow if I question her, so if she's in a point within her own faith experience or she may be questioning things, that somehow I'm losing my faith. I think that's another thing that comes across so strongly, is that it's not okay to be questioning one's own faith, and that strong tradition that if you're questioning it, then you're losing it. Where questioning it can lead us to a deeper understanding and a much deeper faith, because we've worked through problems that, there's a mystery and it's constantly unfolding in front of us, and so we have to, those questions, what we need to do is become comfortable with living in a sense with questions, and then interacting with people who have different kinds of faith or different ways of life can actually help us and enrich our lives instead of, make us fearful.
That's a good point. It's one of the things we try to do with the collegians, isn't it? Because during the collegian years, a certain number of them end up, because of courses and so on, classes they're taking, new ideas, meeting new people and so on, often find their faith called into question. My own mentor used to say that human beings are a question for whom there is no answer, that we are questions. There's a question mark built into the center of our being. Now, sometimes that is rather quiescent. Sometimes we're not actively striving. We don't have new problems and whatever. I often, in talking to groups about the quest in the church, some people come up and say, well, I'm not there. I'm comfortable and things are going well for me. And I always say, good, I'm glad. That's a happy event. The Lord has given you a blessing in a way. But you have to stay open to the fact that maybe questions will arise, and if you look back to your personal history, you'll probably find ways in which you worked your way through certain confusions or rooted yourself more deeply in your family or in your religious traditions. But as you and I deal with people, we meet many of these young people who, for one reason or another, are thrown into turmoil and are questioning and have doubts. And I think what we try to do is to give them a positive sense of that and say, well, this is part of being human, this is life, and it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to learn, deepen your understanding, investigate other things, and the word I like is to reappropriate your own tradition. Make it your own in a new and deeper way. And that's what we all have to do if we're ever going to achieve an adult understanding of the faith. And what gets in the way of it, again, is fear. As you're talking, again, I kept flashing on Herod. What's his problem? His problem is fear, isn't it? He's afraid that someone's going to take over his throne and undercut his own position. That's as the story presents it. Herod has this particular fear and keeps him from being open to the coming of this Messiah.
I think that sense of not having, not being so locked in that I can't move on, I can't broaden my horizons, that somehow it's either I have all the truth or they have all the truth, but not that we sort of share and come at the truth from various perspectives. We seem to be caught in that, in the midst of that, and that's the fear that sort of locks other people and experiences out of our lives, which would really enrich and, like you said, help us to deepen and reappropriate our faith.
But the problem with what you said is with the relativizing of the truth is then you begin to wonder, well, is there any truth around at all? If everyone's got their own perspective, their own outlook, then people are going to say, well, then maybe there isn't any truth. There are no standards. There are no norms. There's no right and wrong, no rules, no principles. And then people suffer when what the sociologists call anomie. That is, they don't have any rootedness, any sense of who they are and where they belong. And I often think that maybe a lot of our young people are just at that point. So I think those of us who have gained a greater sense of pluralism and think that we see that there are various perspectives from which to view reality and various avenues and paths towards a greater truth. Those of us who learn to respect dialogue as a methodology have to have a feel for that fear. We can't just dismiss it. We can't just say, well, grow up and get a more pluralistic sense of life, because I think the deep down worry, and as in so many of our societal problems reveal this, that it'll all break down then. Then every one truth will be as good as another. We will have no standards, and then we will eat into a total relativism and an anarchical kind of society where there aren't any laws anymore.
I think if we're probably honest with ourselves, too, that there may be one aspect of our lives where we're very open and the pluralism does not bother us, and we're very comfortable with that. But if we look at another aspect of our lives, we'll probably find somewhere else where we're not that comfortable. And I think being able to look at our own situation, our own life situation, one person may not be able to understand someone who's who is very prejudiced when it comes to various religious groups, I could look, I may not be able to understand that, but yet if I look at some other aspect of my own life, I can probably find a place where I have those same kind of fears. And to begin to understand that may help put us in touch with why those people are so fearful or prejudiced or whatever way it takes shape.
I think that Matthew, with his story here, is trying to show us the positive good that can come if we overcome the fears. You know, if you look at the Magi, it must have been difficult for them to pick up and follow a star, if you go with the story here, and so that you get a certain feel for them as being adventuresome and willing to check things out, or going to Jerusalem and inquiring and going and following the star again. It's a marvelous statement of an adventuresome spirit, that maybe that's part of what we want to inculcate or get into our own minds and hearts, that it's not just a grudging giving in to a pluralistic viewpoint or the question spirit, but that it's fun, that it's interesting to learn, it's intriguing to talk to people with other viewpoints, to encounter people from other cultures, to listen to programs on television that are different, offbeat, or trying to present us with a more artistic understanding of life or whatever. That's enriching, and why not give it a chance? It can be fun. I must say I marvel at people who maybe are in their 60s or 70s and maintain this open spirit, and even beyond those years they'll continue to go to courses or read books or just be challenged by life. I think that just to stay open to new developments is one of the things that can keep us young or keep the zestful flow of life going.
I also think that it has that sort of creative spirit within us that also helps us, as I see it, to cope with other things that confront us, because we see other ways of doing things. The other thing that came to my mind as you were talking was control. That somehow we always want everything to be neat and tidy because then it's under our control. And I think the adventuresome spirit is the person who maybe realizes that not everything is going to be under their control, but that's okay, that they'll sort of live with maybe a little bit of uncertainty because they've had maybe some positive experience that shows them in the long run there's a lot of growth and a lot of good things that have come from that particular kind of experience.
I think one of the things we've learned from the psychologists and the sociologists as well is that this problem of being closed-minded and prejudiced has to do with needing a scapegoat group, needing a group of people that one can look down upon or say that they are out, because it's a way of building oneself up, of saying we're in the light, there's other people in the darkness. Somehow into our psychology there seems to be built a need to have a group like that. I think a lot of the prejudice that goes on is based on that kind of notion. It's a very destructive kind of impulse to follow, that perhaps it's important to be in touch with what might motivate this kind of closed-minded behavior. So maybe the people of the book in this occasion, in the story in Matthew's Gospel, almost need those foreigners, because it highlights their privileged position as chosen people. And I want to broaden that out. I mean, I don't want that just to be historically rooted in 4 B.C., around the time when we think Jesus was born, 6 or 4 B.C., but to be an ongoing human problem. So, I mean, we've seen it with the racial problem in our own country, I think. Very often it's the sense, well, to have this other group that you can look at, the outs, the people on the margin, then that makes us important because we're in and we're better than they are somehow. We really need to overcome that kind of demonic tendency, I think.
Yeah, and also that kind of allows a kind of excuse for what happened. You know, that we can lay when things aren't going well, and we don't have to take it. It goes back to a sense of responsibility. I don't have to take a kind of responsibility for making something happen and say it's their fault, and then I'm not responsible.
Yeah, their fault. That's true.
It's they and them and them.
Yeah, right. That's true. Whenever we hear the gospel, when we're thinking about the challenge, it's always easy to put it off on others, isn't it? Like, boy, other people ought to hear this sermon. Other people ought to read the story of the Magi, because that would really help them broaden their outlook. And it seems like part of the challenge of the gospel, really, is to let it hit home, to hit in our own hearts. As you said, if we look in our own hearts and check out our own thinking apparatus, we probably find our own blind spots, our illusions, our distortions, the contradictions that are built in there, where we put ourselves in a privileged position vis-a-vis others, and we become part of the problem then of being these exclusivists, these people like Herod and like the inner circle who couldn't see the coming of the Lord.
Yeah, just that strong feeling of being in touch with yourself and how important that is for us to constantly be looking for who we are, because it helps us to understand who other people are too, recognizing our limitations, our gifts, and respecting those in ourselves. That really is the gift that allows us to respect that in others, and therefore helps us to be able to deal with other people and to relate to them.
It's a totally different feeling, isn't it, in conversation, to feel good about your position, that you know what you're talking about, you feel confident. Then you can enter into dialogue, give and take. If you don't feel that, then you either withdraw, don't talk, or you strike out and take the offensive. The best defense is a good offense, and you try to keep the other person at bay. And life looks so much different when we feel confident and know where we are. Then we're able to interact with others. You had a quick comment, I think?
Well, I just was thinking that we don't have that we can enter into dialogue and don't feel like I have to come. A winner is that at least I feel that the other person heard me. They may not change their position, but they heard me.
You don't have to be a winner,
right,
in other words.
It doesn't have to be a winner and a loser.
What we need to do is strive for understanding.
Exactly.
Well, we've started out with the story of the Magi, the astrologers from the East, and we're seeing that it doesn't appear to stand up too well as history. A lot of problems with it, but it's a marvelous story. Throughout the whole of Christian tradition, it's touched people's minds and hearts. It's found in our liturgical feast of the Epiphany, one of the marvelous feasts of the universalism of the Christian message. It comes as a challenge to us to put aside our own narrow-mindedness and to open our mind and heart to the truth and goodness and beauty wherever it is to be found in our world.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Eileen O'Brien, a pastoral associate at Corpus Christi University Parish. The topic of this week's reflection, the Magi and overcoming prejudice. Comments or questions on the show or suggestions for future topics should be sent to Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Campaign of the Diocese of Toledo.